What are the actual chances that this conviction gets set aside? And how come the prosecution just signed off on the sentencing delay? I would have thought they would have fought this thing.
Yeah, it's not clear to me, Steph. Let me take the second part first. It's not clear to me that they signed off on the sentencing delay, at least all the way to September. I think they were willing to take a little bit of a delay for briefing on the question of whether to set aside the verdict. Whether or not September was a surprise to them, we'll learn, I suppose, at a later point in time. But as to the chances of this setting aside the verdict, I think it's a non-frivolous motion based on how transformative the Supreme Court's opinion was. And in particular, there's a portion of that opinion that says when an act is official, not only can you not prosecute it, you can't even use evidence of it to prove someone's knowledge or intent or anything else for that matter in a case having to do with purely private conduct. And that's the thing that the Trump lawyers are really focused on, because in that hush money case, some of the evidence that came in, for example, evidence of Trump's admissions that he was reimbursing Michael Cohen, that came in the way of tweets that Trump issued in May 2018. They also admitted an Office of Government Ethics financial disclosure where Trump made the same admission. And there are other pieces of evidence having to do with the period of time that he's president, not just the checks that he wrote, which I think we could argue are, and agree probably are private, that he wrote them from his private account. The only connection to his White House tenure is that he wrote them in the Oval Office. But there's a series of pieces of evidence and testimony that more credibly relate to his tenure in the White House. That's the basis for Trump's lawyers arguing the verdict should be set aside. I don't think they'll win, but it's not a crazy idea on their part.
All right, Hans, let's talk about the politics here. What is the difference between a July 11th sentencing and September 18th if you're the Trump campaign?
It just gives Trump a little bit more time to totally own and state manage his convention, because the previous sentencing date was right before the Republican National Convention, when everyone's going to be in Milwaukee, and it would have sort of crowded in. Still trying to figure out how to use the phrase non-frivolous. It's a non-frivolous disclaimer to the actual convention. I don't know what a non-frivolous motion is, but I want to yield all my time. Clearly knows her stuff a lot more than I do.
That could be the case any day, every day, and certainly tonight. Hans, Lisa, let me move from frivolous to non-frivolous in that, is there a chance come September 18th, they could argue it's too close to the election, we got to move it again?
I don't think so. And that's because there's no policy in the New York court system or otherwise that would prohibit a defendant from being sentenced. The Trump folks often make a lot of hay out of the Department of Justice policy that says within 60 to 90 days of an election, you don't take overt steps in any investigation. But that doesn't prohibit, for example, a trial from taking place, or for that matter, a sentencing from taking place in the state system. I think if on September 18th, Judge Merchan has ruled against Trump's motion to set aside the verdict, you can count on that sentencing to take place then, unless we've got some other unforeseen circumstance. And given who we're dealing with here, Steph, that's not something you can count out either.
McKay, we are already seeing talk about how if Donald Trump gets back into office, it would be an imperial presidency. How does this immunity ruling play into the goals of Project 2025?
Yeah, look, this is a moment when the nation would really benefit from a political party that was authentically dedicated to limited government power and the rule of law. Unfortunately, we don't have one of those right now, at least not the one that nominated Donald Trump as their presidential nominee. Look, Trump has always had authoritarian impulses. He brags about it. He doesn't make any secret of it. In his first term, the people around him were a mix of advisors who were egging on those impulses, like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, and self-proclaimed adults in the room who were trying to keep those impulses at bay, right? In a second Trump administration, according to everyone I've talked to in the president's orbit, he would make sure that the people who are helping him would be people who are obedient, who are on the same page as him, who want to help him accomplish his agenda by any means necessary. And this ruling just makes it that much easier for him to kind of bulldoze through the guardrails that were in place up to now, and to do what he wants to do is in a second term. And I mean, I do think that it's important to note that a lot of the Republicans who are celebrating this decision are Republicans who not that long ago were on TV berating Black Lives Matter protesters or illegal immigrants in the name of rule of law. And I just don't see a lot of rule of law conservatism at work right now in the response to this decision.
All right, well, let's go into the time machine and go back to 2021. And I want to share why the top Senate Republican, Mitch McConnell, opposed impeaching Donald Trump over January 6th. Just in case we forgot. Watch this.
President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Unless the statute of limitations is run, still liable for everything he did while he was in office. Didn't get away with anything yet. Yet. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
Yet was yesterday. Hans, is that whole argument now out the window?
Was no longer operative according to the Supreme Court. I mean, the civil liabilities may still, I mean, again, I'm going to yield my time to Lisa, but, you know, Mitch McConnell was not prescient. He knows a lot about politics. He knows a lot about the Supreme Court. He clearly didn't know which way the Supreme Court was going to rule on this idea of immunity or absolute immunity for official acts. So the big caveat there for what Senator McConnell, I think then he was the majority leader. No, he wasn't, 2021. So then still minority leader Mitch McConnell. He wasn't making a distinction between criminal and civil. The court clearly did. And the court's making a distinction between official and unofficial acts. But again, I'll yield to Lisa here. I still don't know what constitutes an official act and where the gray area is. And I certainly don't think Mitch McConnell knew at the time. But it's just a question I have. I don't know.
Lisa, Hans is looking for an upgrade. Can you finish this off?
I think Hans is going to have to continue to look because, Steph, look, this decision enunciates some really basic principles, but it certainly doesn't offer a whole lot of guidance. It sort of dumps a big mess in Judge Tanya Chutkin's lap and says, it's up to you to assess what's official versus private. And it certainly says that, for example, she should look to the context and the content of what's going on. But then there are other things that they say she can't look at all. For example, she can't look at what former President Trump's motive or purpose was in executing certain actions and evaluating whether they were official or unofficial. So the reason that he does something is something she's supposed to put purely out of her mind when applying that test. That doesn't give her a lot of guidance as to what should count and what shouldn't.
McKay, I keep thinking about your last answer and sort of that original conservative party and what they stood for. Because this immunity ruling was, yes, it was about Trump's past acts, but we need to think about the future. Because the next Republican president is going to be much more like Donald Trump or will be Donald Trump than your old school conservative Mitt Romney, who you know very well. So how do traditional law and order Republicans feel about this ruling?
Well, Republicans who still believe in the original principle of law and order as it's commonly understood, I think are very nervous about what this decision portends. First of all, because Donald Trump, at least at the moment, seems, very likely to be the next president, or at least it's highly possible. But to your point, Stephanie, whoever is next is probably going to be in Trump's mold. And if you have a president who is already coming to the office with strongman tendencies, authoritarian impulses, and the backing of an increasingly authoritarian conservative base of your party. And now you have this entirely new universe of leeway where you don't have to worry about any kind of, criminal action, criminal fallout for your actions in office. it creates a lot of, it creates a lot of concern. And I think that right now would be a very good time for those Republicans who do authentically believe in law and order to be speaking up, whether they're in office or not in office anymore. This is a crisis moment, I think. This is one of those moments where we need to hear all those voices come to the table. I know a lot of Republicans that you're talking about are sick of responding to Donald Trump. They think that their voices are drowned out, that nobody listens to them. This is a moment where I think that the nation would benefit from hearing from them. It can't just be liberals and Democrats who are panicking about this. We need to hear from across the political spectrum on this issue.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.